Hi, I'm Olivia Belanger, the health solutions reporter for the Keene Sentinel and the host of Invisible Illness. We're so excited to be back for season 2 and for our listeners to be able to experience some new additions to the podcast. You can now watch the interviews for each episode this season on our website or on YouTube, as some of you may be doing right now. We also have made full transcripts available on our website and on YouTube. These editions wouldn't have been possible without funding from the American Press Institute, who we extend our deepest gratitude to for helping with this project. Now for our first episode, please welcome Sabrina Leaf, a 29-year-old Keene resident who is living with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as C-PTSD. As you'll hear, Sabrina was extremely vulnerable with us about the trauma that led to her diagnosis, her struggles to get a diagnosis, and how she is now able to manage her symptoms. Without further delay, here's Sabrina Leaf. Well, Sabrina, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I'd love to start with when you were first diagnosed with CPTSD and what sort of events or symptoms led to that diagnosis.
Sure. I was first diagnosed with CPTSD about 3 years ago when I was 26 or so. But that had been long in the coming for many years. So one of the things that defines CPTSD from PTSD is that with PTSD, there's usually one event particularly that was traumatic that you need to recover from. But with CPTSD, it usually involves repeated and prolonged exposure to trauma. So often it starts in childhood, which it did for me. So I've kind of been living in it and with it all of my life, but it's much harder to get a diagnosis for, and particularly if you're living in it and you're not aware that you're living in trauma. So my parents raised me in a religious cult, so there was a lot of control, a lot of manipulation, a lot of correction through, physical means, through emotional neglect, etc. So I originally went to a doctor for depression and anxiety, and that's when I was diagnosed with CPTSD, as well as manic depression and anxiety and panic disorder, etc.
And we don't need to get too much into this because I'm sure that it's difficult to talk about, and I'm sorry that that's something that you went through. But I'm curious, when did you sort of realize that that was what was happening to you and you needed help? I would imagine that was a hard conclusion to come to.
It is. I didn't have any concept that my life was abnormal from anybody else's until I was about 9 years old. My parents decided to move us from North Carolina to the Panhandle of Florida for a specific cult that they wanted to join. They had been more into a generalized practice of a lot of these different things, but there was a cult particularly that they wanted to join. So we moved into the cult and onto their campus, and our next door neighbor had a couple of kids about my age, and their daughter, Joy, became my best friend. And she was a little older than me, and she really helped show me everything that was going on in our lives. She would help me understand when I was being punished that it wasn't okay to be punished for certain things. When my parents, couldn't or wouldn't feed me, I went to their house to be fed. She taught me how to hide my books. We would keep our books stashed under the beds and in bushes outside. So she not only showed me a lot of what was happening in our childhood, but also gave me the strength and the means to start rebelling against it and to start exploring the world for myself. So once I started reading books in secret, going to the libraries to hide what I was reading, it just really opened my eyes. I started seeing things from such different perspectives, things that I didn't understand, or I had a very angry worldview on, inherited from my family. It was just a huge discovery point, and from there, it just kind of built and built and built. particularly after my father passed away when I was 12, and that kind of shifted our family in a big way. I became one of the main breadwinners for the family. I had a full-time job in high school to keep food on the table, and but that also kind of gave me a bit more of a position of authority in my own life.
Sure.
To be able to start standing up for myself and kind of embracing more of who I am and saying that I don't share these beliefs.
Yeah. Well, that's extremely powerful that you were able to do that at such a young age, and to take that sort of step to saying that you don't want to be involved in that. I'm sure there's so many people that are still in those worlds because they don't have that strength, so you should be really proud of yourself for that.
Thank you.
And how old were you when you officially got out?
Well, we actually left that particular cult shortly after my father died because they kind of turned on my family, started saying really horrible things, and basically drove us out of the church. But my mother and family still practice in those same beliefs to this day. I myself, it was very difficult because when you're raised in trauma and you're raised in religious control like that, you do not get to develop an identity separate from that. I never had a real childhood. I never had that blissful experience of just slowly discovering who I am. I have constant imposter syndrome in terms of like, is this who I am, or is this who I've become through trauma and life and just trying to force things to work. But I didn't officially walk away from that part of my life completely until I was about 23. Okay. It took some years of saying things and starting to walk away, but when your whole identity is wrapped up in that, you're walking away from yourself into just this void. And it's terrifying. Yeah, and, am I making the right decision? Am I overreacting? Well, especially when you've been threatened with hellfire all your life. I'm just sitting there like, is this the best thing for me now? Am I going to end up in hell later? Yeah. Like, am I going to be tortured for eternity? Mm-hmm. That's what I was raised with, so... and you have no one. There's no one on the other side to help you. There's nobody else who can help you determine who you are or how that looks. And it's a very lonely road to recovery, generally. And so when did you decide that you needed help, and what was that journey like to getting a diagnosis? Like you said, it was difficult to get that specific diagnosis. Yeah, it was very difficult. Honestly, the hugest barrier was that I've always lived in poverty and continued to live in poverty and had no access to proper healthcare. The only healthcare that they offer is really like you can go into a clinic and they're like, you're depressed, try some meditation, here's some pills. So I really wasn't able to finally push through those barriers to get to see a psychiatrist and a CBT therapist and everything until I was married, and about 25, 26 is when I had been pursuing it the whole time, but it was just financially and in my life almost impossible. Yeah. It was like crippling, to know that there was something there and I couldn't do anything about it except suffer through it in silence, essentially. Yeah. So when I finally was diagnosed, my CBT therapist was the one who diagnosed me a couple years ago, and he took his time. Based on what I had said, he felt that I had not received proper care or attention, and he felt that just simply depression or anxiety were side symptoms, essentially, of a much bigger problem. So he spent about 5 months with me before he officially gave me the diagnosis of C-PTSD. And since that diagnosis, how is having that helped you, and sort of what are you doing to, combat this? Obviously it's something you're going to have to live with, but what has been helping to sort of alleviate those symptoms? Just having the diagnosis itself was an immense relief to me. Just knowing all my life, essentially, that there was something and that I needed help, but I couldn't have access to it. Just finally having that validation and having someone say, I hear you, I see you, this is what you're struggling with, and I can help you get through it. That has been an immense relief to me. Aside from that, I see a psychiatrist about once every 3 months to just make sure that my medicine is regulated. I was very closed off to taking medicine for many years because that was part of the cult. I wasn't allowed access to regular health care, doctors, medicine, etc. So I was very nervous about taking anything that would, affect my body or what have you. I didn't want to feel like I would become a different person. But honestly, the meds have changed my life. I talk to a lot of other people who struggle with depression or trauma, and I hear those same concerns I had, and all I can tell them is, like, if it doesn't work, come off of it, but please try.
Right.
Like, if you feel comfortable with that, if you get to a point, my brain simply has been redesigned by my circumstances, and it does not produce the chemicals I need. So store-bought is fine, right? Yeah. There's a huge stigma, especially I find since I'm young. Most people feel that it's a phase, or that, I'm just a young person going through anxiety, wanting attention. Right. I'm just taking meds because I'm, a pill-popping young person.
Sure,
I don't know.
Sure.
I get a lot of flack for it, particularly from like middle-aged to older people in the community, but it's made it to where my life is functional.
Yeah.
I can get through my day without dissociating, without panicking, without wanting to kill myself. So I really couldn't go back. There was actually a point where I ran out of my meds between my refill, and I was off of them for about a week, and I had to relive essentially what it was like to live my life without meds, and it was shocking to me. I just suddenly realized, I was crying to my husband one night saying, I lived like this for years and years. I lived like this.
Yeah.
Like, it's truly upsetting to think about. Yeah. And then aside from medicine and therapy, it's a balancing act in my life of working on myself and also just accepting my limitations. Like, for instance, having C-PTSD is exhausting. My brain is constantly tired because I'm always trying to keep up with these perceived threats and whatnot. So I don't have the same energy level as the people around me. And a lot of the time I judge myself for it, and I feel other people are judging me for it. Like, you're young, you should be energetic, you should be getting all these things done. Why can't you? And then I just have to have compassion for myself and be like, okay, I have something else that other people don't have that takes a lot of energy from me. It doesn't look like it does, but it does. A lot of trauma-based work, like I did with my C-PTSD therapy, was identifying triggers and forcing yourself to experience them, to relive those memories, those feelings. So I've done a lot of very emotionally draining work, just really forcing myself to enter into situations that are uncomfortable for me, thinking about things that were truly painful and traumatizing to me. It's all part of the process of healing. A huge temptation for anyone suffering from trauma is to trauma block, to avoid, to not think about it, to just push on and keep that buried deep down. And I've even found that, as time goes on, there are certain parts of the trauma that just pop up because I've become healed enough that I can start to handle some of the other stuff that's been buried deep down. So there's, as I said, it's a balancing act. It's partly working and pushing myself, and also being like, okay, I've pushed myself, and now I have to have compassion.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And you talked a little bit about how, taking medications that stigma you've experienced, people, saying various things to you about, about that. What other misconceptions do you hear a lot when it comes to C-PTSD?
I guess just not knowing what C-PTSD is a huge thing, because people just think, oh, PTSD. Oh, so you had one traumatic event that you just haven't gotten over? That's a huge thing. People are always like, why haven't you gotten over it yet? And there's always some answer that people have of, you haven't meditated. You haven't had a good best girlfriend. You haven't tried going to Machu Picchu. You haven't, it's just everybody has some sort of an explanation and an easy, oh, well, you just haven't tried this.
Right. This is going to change your life.
Always. And I'm like, that's not how this works, but thank you for that.
Yeah.
I guess the recovery, people think of that as being a much easier process too. When I tell people, I mean, I don't advertise it. When I do tell people that I struggle with this, the first reaction I often get is, you're too young. You are too young to have trauma. And it's very invalidating.
Very interesting response.
It is. I'm like, are people too young to get ill, or people too young to die?
Yeah.
I don't understand that response, but essentially I am too young to have had experiences that are actually worth validating.
That must be really difficult to hear, especially because you shouldn't have to explain every single time, well, this is everything that I've been through, actually.
Yes. Well, and that's the thing. People expect an explanation generally. Mm-hmm. They want to hear, what's your reason, and it better be good enough to, in my mind, for you to have a diagnosis and need help and extra compassion.
Yeah.
And as this thing is entitled, Invisible Illness, it's invisible. I look perfectly fine, especially after many years of therapy and work. I am pretty good at presenting happy, typical person.
Sure.
So it's just, a lot of the time I'm just shut down, not believed, not listened to, and people have very little compassion for it.
Right.
I'm held to the same level of expectation as everybody else around me who is perfectly happy and healthy. So that's hard, because it's already a very isolating experience. So that's just even more isolating, when the biggest thing that they say is supposed to help with CPTSD is mending interpersonal bonds, essentially creating connections with society, with friends, with loved ones, and essentially healing those past scars. When the people around you are saying, no, you're not even ill, go away. That's just that much longer of a road of recovery for me, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially because it's already hard enough when you are diagnosed with a mental illness to think, but like, do I really have this? Or, there's a lot of self-doubt, at least from my experience.
There absolutely is, yeah.
Yeah, so like hearing that from outside perspectives just sort of adds to that monster. And is there any advice that you would have for someone who is dealing with, obviously not exactly your same circumstances, but anybody who might think that they're dealing with, a traumatic incident that they're not sure how to handle?
I'd say the first thing is, if you think it, then you probably have. Most people who feel that kind of doubt about whether they've gone through trauma, it's on your mind for a reason. It's something that I think almost everybody who's gone through certain types of trauma experiences, that doubt and that, like, did it really happen to me? Was it really that bad? Is this something I really even need to talk to somebody about? Is this really going to affect me? It already is. It's already taking up your mind space. Please see someone. Please talk to somebody. Even if you only have like one trusted person in your life that you can just say, this is something on my mind. What do you think? Keeping it all inside is just going to make it worse down the road. It certainly did for me. And secondly, we're still here. Every day, you're still here. You still have strength. It's enough to have curiosity about the next day and about what's going to happen. Sometimes that was all I had, when you're dealing with suicidality and that sort of thing, and depression. And there's a huge sense of shame and worthlessness that comes into trauma with CPTSD particularly. there are just some days that didn't seem worth it. So the only thing that kept me going was just being curious. I'd say that was one thing I heard a therapist say to me once, and it stuck with me. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not always feeling optimistic about my future, but I am curious about it, and I'm not really ready to tap out just yet. Something wonderful might happen. Yeah. So my last piece of advice would just be keep pushing at those barriers that keep you from being able to get the real help that you need. It took years and years of me doing that, and it shouldn't, but it's worth it in the end to get the care that you need.